For most of recorded history, slavery was not the exception, it was the rule. From ancient kingdoms to early modern empires, societies across the world accepted the ownership of human beings as part of the natural order. Yet, within just a few generations in the 18th and 19th centuries, that order began to unravel. This documentary traces the long, interconnected history of how slavery, in its most entrenched and global form, was challenged, dismantled, and, at least in law, abolished. It is a story that spans continents, from the plantations of the Caribbean and the cotton fields of the American South to the courts of London, the battlefields of Haiti, the ports of West Africa, and the legislative halls of Rio de Janeiro. Over the course of this journey, we will move from the early Atlantic trade of the 1500s to the final legal abolitions of the late 20th century, tracing not only how the system fell, but also what came after. In doing so, we will explore the legacy of slavery and the meaning of abolition in a world still wrestling with the inequalities it left behind. Slavery is as old as organized society. Long before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, before ships crossed regularly between Africa, Europe, and the Americas, human bondage had been a fixture of civilizations on nearly every continent. While the forms, justifications, and experiences of slavery varied greatly, the core reality remained the same. People were taken from their homes, stripped of their freedom, and forced to labor for others. In the ancient world, slavery was not tied to a single race or continent. In Mesopotamia, records from as far back as the 3rd millennium before the Common Era show enslaved laborers working in temples, households, and farms. Some were prisoners of war, captured in conflicts between city-states like Ur and Lagash. Others were debtors, selling themselves or their children into servitude to pay off what they owed. The Code of Hammurabi, a Babylonian legal text written in the 18th century before the Common Era, even contains specific rules for the treatment and sale of slaves. In ancient Egypt, enslaved people built, farmed, and worked in domestic service. Many were captives from military campaigns in Nubia or the Levant. The pharaohs used them to fill the workforce on state projects and estates. Although Egypt's system allowed for some manumission, freedom granted to certain individuals, the institution was deeply embedded in the political and economic order. In Greece, slavery was a basic pillar of society. By the classical era of the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, Athens depended on a large enslaved population, many of them foreigners taken in war or bought from markets around the Black Sea. They labored in homes, workshops, and especially in the silver mines at Laurium, where conditions were notoriously brutal. Even philosophers who wrote about freedom and virtue, such as Aristotle, defended slavery as a natural institution, claiming that some people were slaves by nature. Rome inherited and expanded these systems on a massive scale. The Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire relied on enslaved labor to an unprecedented degree in the Mediterranean. Victories in wars brought tens of thousands of captives into Roman markets. These captives worked in households, on large agricultural estates called latifundia, in mines, and as skilled artisans. Enslaved people were even used for public entertainment, forced to fight as gladiators. Some, like the famous Spartacus in the 1st century before the Common Era, led large-scale revolts. The Roman elite considered slavery an essential part of their wealth and status. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era, the systems of slavery in Europe shifted. In some regions, outright slavery declined, replaced by forms of serfdom in which peasants were bound to the land rather than owned outright. Still, enslaved labor persisted, particularly in the Mediterranean, where Byzantine, Islamic, and later Italian maritime powers maintained active slave markets. In the Islamic world, slavery took on new forms from the 7th century onward. Following the expansion of Muslim rule across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia and Europe, enslaved people were integrated into societies from Al-Andalus in the west to the Indian subcontinent in the east. Islamic law recognized slavery, but set certain rules for its practice, including rights to humane treatment and the possibility of manumission. Many enslaved people were war captives, while others were obtained through trade. Large numbers came from sub-Saharan Africa via trans-Saharan routes, from Eastern Europe through the Caucasus, or from Central Asia. In Africa itself, systems of servitude and slavery existed long before European contact. Many African societies practiced forms of bondage that were often, but not always, different from the chattel slavery that would later dominate the Atlantic world. Enslaved people could be war captives, criminals, or individuals sold by their families in times of hardship. In some places, they could marry, own property, or eventually gain freedom. Powerful states such as Mali and Songhai used enslaved labor for agriculture, trade caravans, and domestic service. The spread of Islam across parts of Africa expanded existing trade routes, connecting African markets to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. In Asia, slavery and bonded labor took many shapes. In India, systems of debt bondage and caste-based servitude trapped millions in inherited labor obligations. In China, enslaved people were present in various dynasties, often as domestic servants, concubines, or agricultural workers. The Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries absorbed large numbers of captives from its vast conquests. In Southeast Asia, slavery often took the form of war captivity or punishment, with enslaved people integrated into households or royal courts. In the pre-Columbian Americas, forms of slavery and captivity also existed long before European arrival. The Aztecs took captives in war to serve as laborers or for ritual sacrifice. The Inca used the mita system, a form of mandatory labor service to the state, which was not slavery in the strict sense, but could be coercive and punishing. Many indigenous societies enslaved war captives, incorporating them into their communities or trading them with other groups. Although these systems were diverse, they shared a critical point. Slavery was widely accepted as part of life. Across cultures, religion, and politics, people found ways to justify owning others by conquest, by debt, by birth, or by differences in faith or ethnicity. Slavery could be temporary or permanent, harsh or comparatively mild, but it always stripped people of autonomy and placed their labor and bodies under the control of others. What set the stage for change, however, was the gradual linking of these separate systems into larger networks of trade and exchange. By the late Middle Ages, European maritime powers were probing new sea routes. Italian city-states like Genoa and Venice already trafficked enslaved people from the Black Sea region, North Africa, and even parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The Portuguese, exploring the Atlantic coast of Africa in the 15th century, began to tap into and reshape existing African systems of enslavement for their own purposes. These voyages would mark the first steps toward a new kind of slavery, one racialized, hereditary, and tied to the vast plantation economies that would emerge in the Americas. The world before the Atlantic trade was one where slavery was nearly universal, yet often localized in scope. The systems that existed were embedded in political and cultural traditions, but they were not yet unified into a global economy. That transformation would come with the rise of European exploration and colonization, when old practices met new technologies, new markets, and new justifications. By the middle of the 15th century, the scattered systems of slavery that had long existed across the world began to merge into something new. European exploration along the Atlantic coast of Africa, the colonization of newly discovered islands, and the first sustained contacts between Europe, Africa, and the Americas set in motion an economic and social order that would dominate the next 3 centuries. This was the birth of the Atlantic system, a network that combined transoceanic navigation, commercial ambition, and human exploitation on an unprecedented scale. Portugal was the first European power to pioneer this shift. In the early 1500s, Portuguese mariners, backed by their crown and driven by the search for trade routes to Asia, had begun mapping Africa's western shoreline. They established fortified trading posts along the coasts of modern-day Senegal, Gambia, and further south into Angola. At first, their interest was in gold, ivory, and spices. But by the 1440s, the Portuguese also began transporting enslaved Africans to Europe. These captives were purchased from African rulers and traders who already participated in local and regional systems of servitude. The Portuguese quickly discovered that the islands they had claimed in the eastern Atlantic, Madeira, the Azores, and later the Cape Verde Islands, were well suited for sugar cultivation. Sugarcane, which had been grown in the Mediterranean and the Middle East for centuries, required intensive labor. The Portuguese initially relied on European settlers and some free laborers, but they soon turned to enslaved Africans to meet the demands of the crop. This marked a crucial development. African slavery, previously a relatively small presence in Europe, became tied directly to large-scale agricultural production for export. Spain followed a similar path, though on a different timeline. In the late 15th century, following the completion of the Reconquista in 1492 and the sponsorship of Christopher Columbus's voyage, Spain established colonies in the Caribbean. At first, they enslaved indigenous peoples to work in mines and plantations under systems such as the encomienda, which forced labor in exchange for nominal protection and Christian instruction. The catastrophic decline of indigenous populations due to disease, violence, and overwork, losing as much as 90% of their numbers in some regions within a century, created a severe labor shortage. By the early 1500s, Spanish colonists began importing Africans to replace the diminishing indigenous labor force. This shift from local or regional enslavement to a transoceanic trade in African captives was not simply a matter of replacing one labor source with another. It represented a new kind of slavery, racialized, hereditary, and increasingly tied to the global economy. Enslaved Africans were not integrated into households as in many African or Islamic systems, nor were they primarily spoils of local wars. Instead, they became the foundation of a vast plantation economy whose products, sugar, later tobacco, coffee, and cotton, were destined for European markets. The technology of the time made this possible. Advances in ship design, such as the Portuguese caravel, allowed for longer voyages and the ability to sail against prevailing winds. Navigational tools like the astrolabe and improved cartography enabled mariners to plot more precise courses. These innovations reduced the cost and risk of Atlantic crossings, making the trade in goods and people more profitable. The Portuguese and Spanish were soon joined by other European powers. By the early 17th century, the Dutch, English, and French began to establish their own colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas. Each entered into the developing Atlantic trade, building forts along the African coast, negotiating with local rulers, and sending ships filled with European goods, textiles, metalware, firearms, to exchange for enslaved Africans. On the African side, the trade altered political and economic structures. Some kingdoms, such as Congo, Benin, and later Dahomey, became deeply involved in supplying captives to Europeans. Raiding, warfare, and judicial systems were increasingly shaped by the demand for people to sell. Coastal elites gained power and wealth from the trade, while inland regions often suffered depopulation and instability. The Middle Passage, the transatlantic voyage from Africa to the Americas, became the grim centerpiece of this system. By the mid-16th century, ships were making regular runs from ports such as Elmina in modern Ghana or Luanda in modern Angola to sugar plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and Spanish America. Conditions on board were notoriously brutal. Captives were chained, confined in cramped spaces, and given little food or water. Mortality rates were high, sometimes claiming 1 in every 6 or 7 people during the crossing. Brazil emerged as a dominant destination for enslaved Africans in this early period. Portuguese planters expanded sugar production in the fertile Northeast, and by the early 17th century, Brazil was the largest producer of sugar in the world. The labor demands of this industry were relentless. African captives worked long hours under tropical conditions, cutting cane with machetes, hauling it to mills, and feeding the machinery that crushed it. Plantation life was harsh. Discipline was enforced with violence, and life expectancy for enslaved workers was often short. In the Caribbean, Spanish colonies like Hispaniola and Cuba also developed plantation economies. Though these expanded more slowly at first compared to Brazil, the Spanish monopoly over colonial trade limited other European powers, but by the mid-17th century, Dutch, French, and English privateers and traders found ways to insert themselves into the lucrative slave trade. This competition marked the beginning of the multinational nature of the Atlantic system, with rival powers vying for control over shipping lanes, African forts, and Caribbean islands. Religion played a complex role in these developments. The Catholic Church did not forbid slavery outright during this period. Papal bulls, such as Dum Diversas in 1452 and Romanus Pontifex in 1455, had granted Portuguese monarchs the right to conquer and enslave non-Christians in certain contexts. These pronouncements provided a moral and legal framework for European involvement in the African slave trade. At the same time, some individual clergy members and missionaries expressed concern about abuses, particularly toward indigenous peoples in the Americas. However, these voices did not yet mount a sustained challenge to the African trade itself. By the middle of the 17th century, the Atlantic system was firmly in place. It was built on three interconnected flows: European goods to Africa, African captives to the Americas, and American products, especially sugar, back to Europe. This triangular trade was not yet as vast as it would become in the 18th century, but its basic structure and logic were established. The profits from plantation crops and the taxes collected by European crowns reinforced the system's political support. The rise of the Atlantic system marked a turning point in the history of slavery. Whereas earlier forms of bondage were often local, temporary, or based on a variety of criteria, this new system was global, permanent, and increasingly justified through racial ideology. African origin became, in European eyes, a marker of enslavability, and the hereditary transmission of slave status from mother to child entrenched the system over generations. This transformation also reshaped economies and societies on three continents. In Europe, it fueled the growth of port cities like Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam and London. In Africa, it encouraged the rise of coastal states tied to European trade, sometimes at the expense of inland stability. In the Americas, it created plantation societies where the enslaved population often outnumbered the free. By the 16th century, the Atlantic system of slavery was no longer an experiment. It was an established part of European colonial economies. Yet even as it expanded, small but significant voices began to question its morality. These early critics did not yet form a unified abolitionist movement. Instead, their objections arose in scattered contexts: missionary encounters with indigenous peoples, theological debates about Christian ethics, and the growing unease of some religious communities with the brutal realities of the trade. Though limited in scope and often inconsistent, these early discussions planted seeds that would later grow into organized opposition. In the Spanish world, the first sustained debates about slavery emerged from the experience of conquest in the Americas. The violent subjugation of indigenous peoples, through warfare, forced labor in mines, and the encomienda system, prompted controversy within both the church and the royal court. One of the most notable early voices was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who had initially participated in the colonization of Hispaniola. Witnessing the catastrophic decline of indigenous populations, Las Casas became a fierce advocate for their protection. In the early 1500s, Las Casas petitioned the Spanish crown to end the enslavement of indigenous peoples, arguing that they were rational beings with souls, fully capable of receiving Christian teaching. He framed his case within the theological traditions of Catholicism, asserting that forced conversion and cruelty violated Christian duty. His advocacy contributed to the passage of the new laws of 1542, which sought to limit the exploitation of indigenous labor. However, these laws faced fierce resistance from colonial settlers and were often ignored or circumvented. In one of the ironies of history, Las Casas initially suggested the importation of African laborers to replace the indigenous workforce, believing, incorrectly, that Africans would be better able to withstand the harsh conditions of the Americas. Later in life, he regretted this proposal and came to denounce African slavery as well. His changing position illustrates how early critiques of slavery often arose from limited moral frameworks rather than a fully developed belief in universal human freedom. The Spanish debates also played out in formal academic settings. The Valladolid debate of 1550 to 1551 brought together Las Casas and the humanist scholar Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda to discuss the justice of conquest and enslavement. Sepúlveda argued that war against barbarous peoples was justified and that slavery could be a legitimate outcome. Las Casas countered with a defense of peaceful conversion and the inherent dignity of indigenous peoples. While the debate did not produce a decisive policy shift, it signaled that moral and legal questions about slavery were entering public discourse at the highest levels of authority. Meanwhile, in Portugal and its colonies, similar conversations were beginning, though often in more limited form. Some Catholic missionaries, particularly members of the Jesuit order, expressed concern about the treatment of enslaved people in Brazil and Africa. Jesuit priests in Brazil, for example, attempted to shield indigenous converts from enslavement, organizing mission villages where they could live under church protection. These missions often clashed with colonial settlers, who viewed them as a threat to the labor supply. However, Jesuit attitudes toward African slavery were less consistent. Some missionaries condemned the worst abuses without questioning the institution itself. Outside the Catholic sphere, Protestant Europe began to develop its own moral reflections on slavery during the 17th century. Among the earliest and most persistent were the Quakers, also known as the Religious Society of Friends. Founded in England in the 1640s, the Quakers emphasized the inner light within each person, the idea that all individuals carried a divine spark. This belief led some Quakers to question the morality of holding other human beings as property. In the English colonies of North America, Quaker meetings began, by the late 17th century, to discipline members who engaged in the slave trade. In 1688, 4 Germantown Quakers in Pennsylvania issued a protest against slavery, one of the first written petitions in the colonies to condemn the practice outright. Their language was notable for its universality. They argued that to enslave others was inconsistent with the Golden Rule, and that the suffering of Africans was as real and unjust as any oppression Europeans had endured. The Quaker position did not become uniform immediately. Some Friends continued to hold enslaved people for decades, but the moral logic they articulated would later influence broader abolitionist thought. It represented a shift from focusing on the rights or treatment of particular groups to asserting a principle of human equality. Theologians and religious leaders outside of the Quaker tradition also began to grapple with slavery's moral implications, often in complex ways. In England, clerics such as Richard Baxter acknowledged the sinfulness of cruelty toward enslaved people, but stopped short of calling for the abolition of the institution. Baxter argued that slavery was not inherently unlawful according to Scripture, but that unjust enslavement and mistreatment violated Christian ethics. This conditional moral stance mirrored that of many religious authorities of the time, who distinguished between lawful and unlawful slavery rather than rejecting the practice entirely. Another early current of criticism came from formerly enslaved Africans who found a voice in European societies. In the 17th century, figures such as Juan Latino in Spain, a formerly enslaved African who became a scholar and poet, demonstrated through their achievements that Africans were capable of intellectual and moral excellence equal to any European. While not always directly engaged in anti-slavery activism, such individuals challenged the racial prejudices that underpinned European justifications for slavery. It is important to note that these early religious and moral debates did not halt the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. The economic incentives remained too strong, and colonial elites wielded enormous political influence. Even the limited reforms enacted under moral pressure were often undermined in practice. Yet the very existence of public argument over slavery's justice marked a new stage in history. For the first time within the Atlantic world, people were asserting that slavery might not be simply a normal or inevitable part of life, but something that could be judged, criticized, and potentially changed. This period also saw the beginnings of a rhetorical connection between slavery and other forms of oppression. In Europe, where political thought was increasingly concerned with questions of liberty and governance, some thinkers began to use the metaphor of slavery to describe political subjugation. While these analogies did not always extend sympathy to actual enslaved people, They introduced into political discourse the idea that slavery was the opposite of freedom in a universal sense. Over time, this rhetorical shift would make it harder to reconcile the ideals of liberty with the practice of human bondage. In short, the 16th and 17th centuries were a time when moral doubt about slavery began to surface in the Atlantic world. These doubts were scattered and often compromised, but they represented a change from the unquestioning acceptance that had characterized earlier centuries. Missionaries confronted the human costs of colonialism. Theologians debated the limits of Christian justice, and minority religious groups like the Quakers began to voice principled opposition. The groundwork was being laid for the more systematic critiques of the 18th century, when Enlightenment thought, economic analysis, and the powerful testimonies of formerly enslaved people would converge to challenge slavery in ways that could not easily be ignored. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Atlantic slave system had reached a scale and complexity that touched nearly every corner of the Atlantic world. European empires, fortified by profits from plantation crops and the taxes they generated, had little interest in dismantling a system that underpinned their wealth and global influence. Yet this was also the century when the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, the evolving theories of political economy, and, most crucially, the voices of formerly enslaved Africans began to alter the moral and political landscape. The Enlightenment was an age of reason, inquiry, and debate. Philosophers across Europe began to question long-held assumptions about government, religion, and society. Thinkers such as Montesquieu, Denis Diderot, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau grappled with the nature of liberty, justice, and human equality. Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, published in the mid-18th century, wrote satirically about the absurd justifications Europeans used for enslaving Africans, suggesting that these arguments collapsed under rational scrutiny. Though he did not call for immediate abolition, his willingness to treat slavery as a subject open to reasoned criticism marked a break from the unquestioning acceptance of earlier centuries. In Britain, the Scottish Enlightenment produced its own challenges to slavery through the field of political economy. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, argued that free labor was generally more productive than slave labor. His reasoning was grounded not only in efficiency, but in the understanding that people work harder when they benefit from their labor. Smith's critique was not a moral manifesto, but it introduced an economic argument against slavery that appealed to pragmatic policymakers and merchants. These intellectual developments coincided with the growing participation of the public in political life. Coffeehouses, pamphlets, and newspapers allowed ideas to circulate far more widely than in previous centuries. This meant that arguments about slavery, whether moral, religious, or economic, could reach audiences beyond the small circles of scholars and clergy. By the mid-18th century, an emerging public sphere was beginning to debate slavery in terms that appealed to reason, justice, and national interest. At the same time, the most powerful challenges to slavery came from those who had experienced it firsthand. The 18th century saw a notable rise in published autobiographies and narratives by formerly enslaved Africans, many of whom had gained literacy through missionary education or personal determination. Their works combined personal testimony with political argument, humanizing a system that was often discussed in abstract terms. Olaudah Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vassa, became one of the most influential of these authors. Born in what is now Nigeria, he was kidnapped as a child, endured the Middle Passage, and was enslaved in the Americas before purchasing his freedom. In 1789, Equiano published The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, which recounted his experiences in vivid detail and appealed directly to British readers' sense of morality and justice. The book became a bestseller, went through multiple editions, and was widely read in Britain and beyond. Equiano's narrative did more than recount suffering. It argued for the humanity, intelligence, and moral worth of Africans, undermining the racist ideologies that justified slavery. Another significant voice was Ottobah Cugoano, a member of London's African community and a contemporary of Equiano. His thoughts and sentiments on the evil and wicked traffic of the slavery and commerce of the human species, published in 1787, was an uncompromising denunciation of both the slave trade and the institution of slavery. Cugoano demanded immediate abolition, framing his argument in both moral and Christian terms, and calling out the hypocrisy of European nations that prided themselves on liberty while profiting from human bondage. In addition to these individuals, African communities in Europe, such as the Sons of Africa group in London, organized campaigns, wrote letters to newspapers, and petitioned Parliament. They formed a crucial link between the lived experience of slavery and the emerging abolitionist networks in Britain. Their activism demonstrated that formerly enslaved people were not passive subjects of debate, but active participants shaping the conversation. Religious revival movements also intersected with Enlightenment thinking to strengthen opposition to slavery. The Evangelical Revival in Britain and the Great Awakening in North America emphasized personal salvation, moral reform, and the equality of all souls before God. Leaders such as John Wesley, founder of Methodism, condemned slavery in strong terms. In his Thoughts Upon Slavery, published in 1774, Wesley described the horrors of the Middle Passage and called the trade the sum of all villainies. Evangelical preachers often reached working-class audiences, spreading anti-slavery sentiment beyond elite intellectual circles. Economic shifts further complicated the picture. By the latter half of the 18th century, some British merchants and manufacturers saw the slave trade as less essential to national prosperity than in previous decades. The early stages of the Industrial Revolution created new forms of wealth not directly tied to plantation economies. This did not mean that slavery ceased to matter economically. Cotton from slave plantations would fuel British industry for decades. But it opened space for arguments that Britain could thrive without the trade. In France, Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality also found expression in anti-slavery thought. Philosophers, such as the Abbé Raynal, condemned the slave trade in works like Philosophical and Political History of the Two Indies, which combined history, political analysis, and moral outrage. Raynal predicted that the enslaved themselves would one day rise up to claim their freedom, a prediction that would seem prophetic after the Haitian Revolution. Yet these intellectual and literary currents faced strong resistance. The slave trade had powerful defenders among planters, colonial merchants, and politicians with vested interests. They argued that the trade was necessary for imperial prosperity, that African societies willingly sold captives, and that abolition would devastate colonial economies. Racial theories that portrayed Africans as inherently suited for hard labor underpinned these defenses, and such ideas found an audience in parts of the scientific community as well as popular culture. What distinguished the 18th century from earlier periods was not that these arguments existed, but that they were increasingly contested in public. Pamphlets and books were printed in large numbers. Debates took place in Parliament, in coffee houses, and in the press. And formerly enslaved people spoke directly to the British and European public in their own words. The combination of Enlightenment ideals, economic reasoning, religious conviction, and personal testimony created a foundation for the more organized abolitionist movements that would soon emerge. By the end of the 18th century, the moral case against slavery had gained more traction than ever before. It was no longer confined to isolated voices or small religious sects. Instead, it was becoming part of a broader discourse about the rights of man, the limits of empire, and the meaning of liberty in an age that celebrated reason and progress. By the final third of the 18th century, the intellectual, moral, and religious critiques of slavery were converging with a new phenomenon: organized political mobilization. Nowhere was this more visible than in Britain, where legal decisions, shocking public scandals, and coordinated activism began to transform the anti-slavery cause from scattered debate into a structured national movement. The years between the early 1770s and the late 1780s were decisive in shaping how abolition would be fought, through courts, parliament, the press, and public opinion. One of the first significant legal landmarks came in the case of Somerset v. Stuart in 1772. James Somerset, an African man enslaved in Virginia, had been brought to England by his master, Charles Stuart. While in London, Somerset escaped but was recaptured and placed aboard a ship bound for Jamaica, where Stuart intended to sell him. Friends and abolitionist allies petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus, challenging the legality of his detention. The case reached Lord Mansfield, Chief Justice of the King's Bench. Lord Mansfield's decision was narrowly framed. He ruled that English common law did not provide a basis for forcibly removing Somerset from England to be sold into slavery. Importantly, Mansfield did not declare slavery illegal throughout the British Empire, nor did he free all enslaved people in Britain. Yet the public interpreted the judgment as a sweeping blow against slavery in England, and its symbolic power was enormous. For the first time, many began to believe that British soil offered freedom to anyone who set foot on it. While the Somerset case galvanized moral opponents of slavery, it did not directly address the transatlantic trade itself. That issue came into public focus through an event that horrified Britain: the Zong Massacre of 1781. The Zong was a British slave ship transporting Africans across the Atlantic. Due to navigational errors and shortages of water, the crew threw more than 130 captives overboard to save provisions for the rest. The ship's owners later filed an insurance claim for the value of the drowned enslaved people, treating the incident as a financial loss of cargo. When details of the massacre emerged, thanks in part to the efforts of Granville Sharp, public outrage was immediate. Sharp, who had been active in anti-slavery circles since the 1760s, tried to bring murder charges against the crew, though without success. The courts treated the case as a property dispute, but the moral impact was devastating to defenders of the trade. The idea that human beings could be casually killed for insurance money and the perpetrators face no criminal accountability shocked many who had previously been indifferent. The Zong case coincided with the emergence of a more coordinated abolitionist network. Granville Sharp was joined by younger activists like Thomas Clarkson, who began gathering first-hand accounts of the slave trade's brutality. Clarkson, a Cambridge-educated scholar, was initially motivated by a Latin essay competition in 1785. His essay on the subject of whether slavery was lawful won first prize and convinced him to dedicate his life to the cause. He began traveling to major port cities such as Bristol and Liverpool, interviewing sailors, collecting shackles and branding irons as evidence, and documenting the horrific conditions aboard slave ships. In 1787, Clarkson and Sharp joined forces with a group of Quakers to establish the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This organization became the first national body devoted specifically to ending Britain's role in the transatlantic trade. Its members understood the power of public persuasion. They produced pamphlets, distributed petitions, and organized boycotts of goods like West Indian sugar, encouraging consumers to reject products tainted by slavery. One of the most effective strategies of the society was visual communication. In 1787, they commissioned the now famous diagram of the slave ship Brooks, which depicted hundreds of human figures tightly packed in rows, illustrating how captives were transported across the Atlantic. The image was widely circulated and brought the physical reality of the Middle Passage into British homes and meeting halls. It stripped away abstractions and made the cruelty of the trade visible in stark detail. While grassroots activism grew, abolitionist leaders also sought parliamentary allies. William Wilberforce, a young member of Parliament with strong evangelical convictions, emerged as the movement's most prominent political voice. Encouraged by his friend and former Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, Wilberforce took up the cause in the House of Commons, pledging to work toward legislative abolition. His speeches framed the issue in both moral and national terms, portraying Britain's participation in the slave trade as a stain on the nation's honor. Abolitionists faced formidable opposition. Many MPs represented constituencies dependent on the trade, especially in port cities like Liverpool. The West India lobby, wealthy planters and merchants with deep financial stakes, argued that abolition would destroy colonial economies, damage Britain's global standing, and benefit rival powers like France and Spain. They portrayed slavery as a necessary, even benevolent, institution that brought civilization and Christianity to Africans, while conveniently ignoring the violence and exploitation at its core. Despite these obstacles, the anti-slavery movement continued to innovate. Public petitions became a hallmark of their campaign. Local abolitionist committees gathered signatures from across Britain, demonstrating that ordinary citizens cared deeply about the issue. This method not only pressured Parliament but also fostered a sense of shared moral responsibility among supporters. Women played a crucial role in this mobilization, even though they could not vote or hold office. Figures like Hannah More, a writer and philanthropist, used literature and poetry to sway opinion. Women organized boycotts, hosted public meetings, and produced goods, such as "not made by slaves" sugar bowls, to promote the cause. Their activism extended the reach of abolitionism into households and communities that might otherwise have remained disengaged. The period between 1772 and 1787 was therefore a turning point. Legal cases like Somerset's and the Zong Massacre revealed the moral contradictions of slavery and the trade, while new forms of activism, combining evidence gathering, public education, consumer boycotts, and parliamentary lobbying, created a template for modern social movements. These years did not end the trade, but they built the organizational and political foundation upon which future victories would rest. By the eve of the Haitian Revolution and the upheavals of the French Revolution, Britain's abolitionist movement was poised for a new phase, one in which events beyond its shores would dramatically shape its course. By the final decade of the 18th century, the most radical and transformative challenge to slavery in the Atlantic world was not coming from the floor of Parliament or from the pens of European philosophers. It came instead from the plantations, mountains, and battlefields of a French Caribbean colony called Saint-Domingue, known today as Haiti. This uprising would become the only instance in history where a large enslaved population rose up, defeated the armies of multiple European empires, and permanently abolished slavery, founding an independent state led by formerly enslaved people. Saint-Domingue was the jewel of France's colonial empire. Located on the western third of the island of Hispaniola, it was by the 1780s the richest colony in the Caribbean, producing vast quantities of sugar, coffee, indigo, and other lucrative crops. The colony's wealth came at a staggering human cost. Enslaved Africans made up roughly 9/10 of the population, with a smaller group of free people of color and an even smaller number of white colonists. Mortality rates among enslaved workers were high, and the brutal pace of plantation labor ensured a constant demand for new captives from Africa. The social hierarchy was complex and deeply unstable. At the top were the Grands Blancs, the wealthy white planters who owned the largest estates and wielded political power. Below them were the Petites Blancs, often poor or middle-class whites who worked as artisans, overseers, or small traders, but still fiercely defended their racial privilege. The free people of color, many of them of mixed African and European ancestry, occupied a legally ambiguous position. Some were wealthy landowners and even slaveholders themselves, yet they faced racial discrimination and legal restrictions despite their freedom and property. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, sent shockwaves through this already volatile society. In France, revolutionary leaders declared the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Free people of color in Saint-Domingue seized on this language to demand equal political rights with whites. Their petitions and occasional armed demonstrations in the early 1790s heightened tensions between them and the white colonists. The enslaved majority watched these struggles closely. The revolutionary ideals from France, combined with news of abolitionist agitation in Britain and growing unrest across the Caribbean, helped to inspire a movement for freedom. On the night of August 22, 1791, thousands of enslaved people in the northern plain of Saint-Domingue rose in coordinated rebellion. They burned plantations, destroyed sugar works, and killed many of the whites they encountered. The uprising spread rapidly, and within weeks the colonial authorities faced a full-scale war. This was not a spontaneous outbreak, but the result of careful planning. Leaders such as Boukman, a Maroon, escaped slave, and religious figure are said to have played a central role in organizing the revolt. Early in the struggle, the rebels demanded not only better working conditions, but freedom itself, a demand that soon became non-negotiable. The French colonial government, overwhelmed by the scale of the insurrection, found itself caught between fighting the rebels and dealing with the increasingly tense political situation between whites and free people of color. In 1793, as France became embroiled in war with Britain and Spain, French commissioners in the colony made a momentous decision. They abolished slavery in the northern province to gain the loyalty of the rebel forces. Events in France quickly overtook this partial measure. The revolutionary government in Paris, now dominated by radical Jacobins, extended the abolition decree to all French colonies in February 1794. This was the first time a major European power had outlawed slavery in all of its territories. For the rebels in Saint-Domingue, the decree was both a validation of their struggle and a new political reality. They were now fighting not as enslaved people seeking freedom, but as citizens defending their emancipation. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge from this struggle was Toussaint L'Ouverture. Born into slavery around 1743, Louverture gained his freedom in his 30s and became a skilled plantation manager. When the uprising began, he initially held back but soon joined the rebel forces, bringing with him both military skill and political vision. Over the next decade, Louverture rose to command the colony's armies, forging alliances, navigating French politics, and defeating invading British and Spanish forces. Under Louverture's leadership, the formerly enslaved population proved capable of organizing disciplined armies that could match and defeat seasoned European troops. The struggle was brutal on all sides, with atrocities committed by both rebels and colonial forces. Yet the determination of the emancipated population never wavered. By the turn of the century, Louverture had consolidated control over the colony. In 1801, he promulgated a constitution for Saint-Domingue that confirmed the abolition of slavery and established himself as governor for life under nominal French sovereignty. But the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in France brought new threats. Napoleon, seeking to restore France's colonial profits, dispatched a large expeditionary force in 1802 under his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc, with orders to reassert control and, though not stated openly, to reintroduce slavery. The war that followed was one of the fiercest colonial conflicts of the era. Initially, Louverture was captured through treachery and sent to France, where he died in prison in 1803. Yet his lieutenants, notably Jean-Jacques Dessalines, carried on the fight. The French forces, weakened by yellow fever and relentless guerrilla warfare, suffered catastrophic losses. By the end of 1803, the French army was in retreat. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines declared the independence of Haiti, making it the first modern nation to permanently abolish slavery and be governed by black leaders. The new state's constitution enshrined the principle that no person could be enslaved on Haitian soil. This was more than a political victory. It was a complete inversion of the racial order that had defined the Atlantic world for centuries. The consequences of the Haitian Revolution were profound and far-reaching. For enslaved people across the Americas, it was a beacon of hope and a concrete example that freedom could be won through collective action. In colonies like Jamaica, Cuba, and Louisiana, rumors of what happened in Saint-Domingue fueled both dreams of liberation and fears among slaveholders. For European powers, Haiti's victory was a geopolitical shock. France lost its most profitable colony, which contributed to Napoleon's decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. The revolution also hardened racial attitudes among slaveholding elites elsewhere, who feared the spread of similar uprisings and sought to tighten control over enslaved populations. Britain and the United States responded to Haiti's independence with caution, refusing formal recognition for decades due to their own interests in maintaining slavery. Yet neither could ignore the strategic importance of the new nation. Haitian leaders, for their part, faced the immense challenge of building a free society in the shadow of economic isolation, diplomatic hostility, and the lingering devastation of years of war. The Haitian Revolution stands as a unique episode in the global history of slavery. It was not granted by law from a distant parliament, nor negotiated as a gradual reform. It was seized, defended, and institutionalized by the very people who had once been enslaved. This made it both a symbol of possibility and a source of fear, depending on one's position in the Atlantic world. In the wake of Haiti's success, the question of slavery's survival became more urgent in political debates elsewhere. In Britain, abolitionists pointed to Haiti as proof that emancipation need not destroy a society, while opponents used it as a cautionary tale of chaos and violence. The first years of the 19th century marked a decisive moment in Britain's long struggle over the slave trade. Decades of moral campaigning, public mobilization, and political maneuvering, combined with shifting economic and geopolitical conditions, culminated in a legislative victory that would transform Britain's role in the Atlantic world. Yet the end of Britain's legal participation in the transatlantic trade was only the beginning of a new phase. The British government would commit itself to suppressing the slave trade across the Atlantic, deploying its navy and diplomatic weight to pursue a goal that proved far more difficult in practice than it appeared on paper. By the turn of the century, abolitionists in Britain had built a formidable national movement. Figures like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce had kept the issue in Parliament and before the public for years, despite repeated defeats in the House of Commons. The outbreak of war with revolutionary France in 1793 initially slowed progress as political attention shifted, and opponents of abolition argued that the trade was essential to Britain's colonial and military strength. Yet over time, the war itself began to alter the political landscape in ways that favored abolition. First, Britain's conflict with France made colonies and trade routes more vulnerable. The loss of Saint-Domingue to the Haitian Revolution had already dealt a blow to France's plantation economy. British policymakers began to recognize that controlling or disrupting the slave trade could serve as a strategic weapon against enemy powers. Second, abolitionist lobbying never ceased, and public opinion, strengthened by petitions, pamphlets, and religious appeals, continued to press for change. The sheer persistence of the movement kept the question alive in national debate. By 1806, the political tides had shifted enough for a breakthrough. That year, Britain passed the Foreign Slave Trade Act, prohibiting British subjects from participating in supplying slaves to foreign colonies. It was a partial measure, but it cleared the way for the more sweeping Slave Trade Act of 1807. Passed by Parliament in March of that year, the act made it illegal for British ships or citizens to engage in the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. It came into effect on the 1st of May, and although it did not abolish slavery within the British Empire, that would take another quarter century, it ended Britain's formal role in transporting captives across the Atlantic. Abolitionists celebrated the act as a great moral victory, but they were also aware that the trade would not vanish overnight. Many foreign powers continued to operate their own slave ships, and the lucrative nature of the trade encouraged smuggling and evasion. To enforce the ban, Britain turned to its most powerful maritime asset, the Royal Navy. In 1808, the same year the United States passed its own ban on the transatlantic trade, Britain established the West Africa Squadron. This naval force was tasked with patrolling the West African coast, intercepting slave ships, and freeing the captives aboard. Over the next 6 decades, the squadron would grow into a persistent, though imperfect, instrument of suppression. The squadron's work was challenging and dangerous. Slave ships were often fast, lightly built vessels designed to outrun pursuers. Captains took elaborate measures to evade detection, including falsifying papers and flying the flags of nations whose governments had not banned the trade. The geography of the African coastline, with its many inlets and river mouths, provided countless hiding places. Naval crews not only faced combat with slavers who resisted capture, but also endured harsh climates and high rates of disease, especially malaria and yellow fever. Captured ships were brought before special mixed commission courts, established by treaty with other powers, to determine whether their voyages violated anti-slave trade laws. These courts were located in key ports such as Freetown in Sierra Leone, Havana in Cuba, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. When ships were condemned, their captives were freed. often in Sierra Leone, which became a center for resettled Africans liberated from intercepted vessels. Known as liberated Africans, these men, women, and children came from diverse ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, creating a multi-ethnic community that developed its own cultural and social life in the colony. Diplomacy was essential to the suppression effort. Britain signed a series of treaties with other European and American powers, granting the right of search to intercept ships flying their flags. Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands agreed to varying restrictions under British pressure, though compliance was inconsistent. France, after restoring slavery in some colonies under Napoleon, re-entered the anti-slavery camp following his fall. The United States cooperated at times, though tensions over maritime rights sometimes complicated the relationship. Despite these efforts, the illegal trade persisted, especially to markets in Brazil and Cuba. Slave traders adapted to the new environment by using faster ships, operating under false flags, and shifting embarkation points along the coast. In some years, as many as half of all intercepted ships carried the flag of a nation with which Britain did not have a right of search treaty, forcing naval officers to watch suspected slavers sail past without intervention. Within Britain, the end of the slave trade also had complex economic consequences. Some ports that had profited from outfitting slave ships, such as Liverpool and Bristol, experienced declines in certain sectors, though others adapted by focusing on legal commodities. The abolition of the trade also intensified debates about the future of slavery itself in British colonies. Planters in the Caribbean complained that the ban made it harder to maintain their labor force, while abolitionists pointed to this as evidence that the institution was unsustainable and should be ended entirely. The moral symbolism of Britain's commitment to suppressing the trade was significant, especially as the country began to cast itself as a global champion of abolition. Yet critics pointed out the contradictions in a policy that still tolerated slavery within the empire and sometimes used suppression as a justification for expanding imperial control in Africa. The presence of the Royal Navy along the West African coast facilitated increased British influence in the region, blurring the lines between humanitarian intervention and imperial expansion. Over time, however, the combination of naval pressure, diplomatic agreements, and changing economic conditions began to reduce the scale of the transatlantic trade. Brazil, long the largest importer of enslaved Africans, formally ended its trade in 1850, though illegal voyages continued for some years. Cuba, under Spanish control, was slower to comply, with significant smuggling persisting into the 1860s. By 1867, Britain signed its last major anti-slave trade treaty of the century with the Sultan of Zanzibar, extending suppression efforts into the Indian Ocean. The West Africa Squadron's mission gradually diminished in scope as the Atlantic trade declined, though slavery in various forms persisted in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The end of Britain's legal participation in the transatlantic trade and its subsequent suppression campaign marked a turning point in the history of abolition. It demonstrated that a major maritime power could not only withdraw from the trade, but also use its navy and diplomacy to pressure others to follow suit. Yet it also revealed the limits of such efforts in the face of entrenched economic interests, adaptive smuggling networks, and the broader persistence of slavery as an institution. The next great challenge for abolitionists would be to confront slavery itself within the British Empire, a battle that would draw on the lessons of the anti-slave trade campaign, but also require new strategies, alliances, and acts of resistance from the enslaved. By the early 1830s, Britain had been out of the transatlantic slave trade for more than 2 decades, yet slavery itself still formed the foundation of the colonial economies in the Caribbean, Mauritius, and parts of Canada and South Africa. The plantations of Jamaica, Barbados, and other colonies continued to operate under the same system of forced labor, sustained by the legal ownership of human beings. For abolitionists, ending the trade had been only the first step. The next and far more contentious battle was to abolish slavery entirely within the British Empire. This struggle reached its decisive moment in the wake of one of the largest uprisings of enslaved people in the history of the Caribbean, the Baptist War in Jamaica. also known as the Christmas Rebellion. It erupted in late December of 1831 under the leadership of Samuel Sharp, an enslaved Baptist deacon. Sharp, literate and deeply religious, had been influenced by missionary preaching about justice and freedom. He believed that peaceful protest could persuade the colonial authorities to grant emancipation. Sharp's plan was for enslaved workers to refuse labor after Christmas until wages were introduced. However, the protest quickly escalated into a full-scale rebellion involving as many as 60,000 enslaved people across the island, around 1/5 of Jamaica's entire enslaved population. Plantations were set ablaze, and the rebellion spread rapidly despite attempts at negotiation. The colonial authorities responded with overwhelming force. Troops and militia units brutally suppressed the uprising over the course of 2 weeks, killing hundreds in combat and executing many more in the aftermath. Samuel Sharp himself was hanged in May of 1832. Before his death, he declared, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." News of the rebellion and the violent reprisals shocked the British public. Missionaries in Jamaica, many of them Baptists, were accused by planters of inciting the uprising, leading to attacks on chapels and clergy. Back in Britain, however, these same missionaries became key witnesses in parliamentary inquiries, providing first-hand testimony about the conditions on plantations and the causes of unrest. For the abolitionist movement, the Baptist War proved to be a turning point. It underscored the reality that slavery could not be maintained without constant coercion and the threat of violence, and that enslaved people themselves were determined to claim their freedom. It also strengthened the argument that emancipation was not only a moral imperative, but a practical necessity to prevent further bloodshed. In Parliament, debates over emancipation had been building for years. The Anti-Slavery Society, formed in 1823, had coordinated petitions, public lectures, and publications to keep the issue in the public eye. The sheer scale of popular engagement was remarkable. In 1833, hundreds of thousands of Britons signed petitions calling for the end of slavery, making it one of the largest public campaigns in British history up to that point. Political change in Britain also played a role. The passage of the Reform Act in 1832 expanded the electorate and shifted parliamentary representation in ways that weakened the West India Lobby, the powerful alliance of colonial planters and merchants who defended slavery. With fewer MPs directly tied to plantation interests, abolitionist proposals faced less organized resistance. In August of 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. The law decreed that slavery would be abolished in most British colonies as of August 1, 1834. However, it introduced a transitional system known as apprenticeship, in which formerly enslaved people were required to continue working for their former masters for a set number of years, 6 for field laborers and 4 for domestic workers, ostensibly to prepare them for freedom. Planters were compensated by the British government to the tune of £20 million, an enormous sum at the time, while the emancipated received no financial restitution. The apprenticeship system was deeply unpopular among the freed population and quickly came under criticism from abolitionists who saw it as little more than slavery under another name. Reports of abuse and exploitation during apprenticeship fueled campaigns for its early termination. In 1838, following sustained pressure from both the colonies and Britain, Parliament abolished the system, granting full legal freedom to all remaining apprentices. The transition from slavery to freedom was complex and uneven. In Jamaica, Barbados, and other islands, many formerly enslaved people left the estates in search of independent livelihoods, often establishing free villages where they could farm their own plots of land. Planters, facing labor shortages, attempted to use high rents, restrictive laws, and imported indentured workers from India and elsewhere to maintain control over the agricultural workforce. Religious institutions played a central role in the early post-emancipation years. Churches, especially Baptist and Methodist congregations, helped provide education, spiritual guidance, and a measure of community autonomy. Education was seen as both a tool for uplift and a safeguard against planter domination. Schools were often built in the free villages, sometimes with assistance from missionary societies in Britain. For the British abolitionist movement, the abolition of slavery within the empire was a moment of triumph, vindicating decades of effort. Yet it also raised new questions about the global nature of the institution. Even as Britain celebrated its moral leadership, millions remained enslaved in the United States, Brazil, Cuba, and other territories. The empire itself was not free of coercive labor systems, as the importation of indentured laborers to replace emancipated Africans made clear. The legacy of emancipation in the British Empire was therefore twofold. On one hand, it demonstrated that a major colonial power could dismantle slavery through legislative means without the collapse of its imperial system, though not without profound economic and social upheaval. On the other hand, it showed that legal freedom did not automatically produce equality or security, and that new forms of labor exploitation could emerge to take the place of slavery. By 1838, Britain had positioned itself as a leader in the global struggle against slavery, at least in the legal sense. The next phase of abolitionist activity would look beyond the empire's borders, as British diplomats, missionaries, and naval officers sought to influence emancipation efforts in other colonial powers. But the story of abolition in the Atlantic world was far from complete. While Britain's abolition of slavery within its empire in the 1830s was a landmark event, the story of emancipation in the Caribbean was far from uniform. Each European colonial power approached the end of slavery differently, shaped by its own political upheavals, economic interests, and the actions of enslaved people themselves. In the French, Danish, Dutch, and Spanish Caribbean, the road to freedom unfolded over nearly a century, marked by sudden revolutionary changes, gradual legislative reforms, and fierce resistance from planters determined to preserve the old order. The French experience was the most turbulent, beginning not with gradual reform, but with the upheaval of the French Revolution. In 1794, amid political chaos in France and fierce struggles in its Caribbean colonies, the revolutionary government in Paris decreed the abolition of slavery in all French territories. This decision was partly a recognition of the military reality in places like Saint-Domingue, where the Haitian Revolution had already forced the issue, and partly a reflection of revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. However, the abolition of 1794 proved fragile. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, he sought to restore French control over its colonies and their lucrative plantation economies. In 1802, Napoleon reinstated slavery in the Caribbean islands still under French control, such as Guadeloupe and Martinique. This reversal provoked fierce resistance in Guadeloupe, where formerly free people of color and black soldiers fought against French forces in a bloody conflict. Despite their efforts, slavery was reimposed and the plantation system revived. It was not until 1848, under the Second French Republic, that France definitively abolished slavery in all its colonies. This final emancipation owed much to the work of Victor Schœlcher, an undersecretary for the colonies and a determined abolitionist. Schœlcher had toured the Caribbean, gathered evidence of abuses, and pressed the case that slavery was incompatible with the principles of the Republic. His efforts, combined with pressure from abolitionists and the growing recognition that slavery was an untenable institution, led to the decree of April 1848, which freed more than 250,000 people across the French colonial empire. In the Danish West Indies, comprising St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, the path to emancipation followed a different course. Denmark, though a small colonial power, was among the first European nations to legislate against the slave trade, passing a ban in 1792 to take effect in 1803. This early action, however, did not address slavery itself, which remained entrenched on the islands. By the mid-19th century, discontent among the enslaved population was rising. The turning point came in July of 1848, when a massive revolt erupted on St. Croix. Led by Moses Gottlieb, known as General Budo, the rebels gathered in Frederiksted and demanded their freedom. Faced with the threat of widespread violence and destruction, the Danish governor, Peter von Scholten, declared the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people in the Danish West Indies. While Copenhagen later criticized von Scholten for acting without authorization, the decree stood and slavery in the Danish colonies ended abruptly rather than through gradual legislation. The Dutch Caribbean, encompassing Suriname, Curaçao, and several smaller islands, experienced emancipation later than many of its neighbors. The Netherlands formally abolished slavery in its colonies in 1863, freeing around 45,000 people in Suriname and the Dutch Antilles. However, as in Britain's apprenticeship system, the Dutch required the freed population in Suriname to work on plantations for a further 10 years under contracts that severely restricted their freedom. This state supervision period kept many people tied to the same estates, delaying the true experience of liberty until 1873. The Spanish Caribbean, particularly Cuba and Puerto Rico, was the last stronghold of slavery in the region. In both colonies, the sugar industry was booming in the 19th century, fueled by the importation of enslaved Africans even after Spain had signed treaties with Britain to end the trade. Smuggling and fraudulent papers kept the flow of captives alive for decades, especially to Cuba. In Puerto Rico, abolition came relatively early by Spanish colonial standards, but still later than in the British or French Caribbean. Following growing anti-slavery sentiment, pressure from liberal factions in Spain, and increasing unrest among the enslaved population, the Spanish Cortes passed the Moray Law in 1870, which granted freedom to children born to enslaved mothers after that date, and to slaves over 60 years old. Finally, in 1873, Spain enacted a law that abolished slavery in Puerto Rico, freeing around 30,000 people. Like the Dutch, Spain imposed a transitional system requiring the freed population to work for their former masters for a set period, 3 years, before achieving full independence. Cuba's emancipation was the most protracted of all. The island's planters, supported by colonial authorities, resisted abolition fiercely, fearing economic collapse and social unrest. The 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878, a Cuban independence struggle, brought the question of slavery to the forefront, as rebel forces often promised freedom to enslaved people who joined their cause. In 1880, Spain passed the Patronato Law, which formally ended slavery, but placed the freed people into a patronage system that bound them to their former owners as apprentices for 8 more years. Mounting political pressure and the impracticality of enforcing the system led to its termination in 1886, finally ending legal slavery in the Spanish Empire. Across these different colonial powers, several patterns emerge. In almost every case, emancipation was shaped not solely by metropolitan legislation, but by the actions of the enslaved themselves. Rebellions, strikes, and the daily resistance of enslaved workers made slavery increasingly costly and unstable. Economic factors also played a role. As global sugar prices fluctuated and new sources of labor emerged, some planters began to see slavery as less essential to profitability. The international climate of the 19th century further encouraged abolition. Britain's diplomatic and naval campaign against the slave trade put pressure on other European powers, while liberal political movements in Europe made it harder for governments to defend an institution widely condemned as inhumane. Nevertheless, planter elites often extracted concessions, such as apprenticeship or state supervision periods, to cushion the transition and maintain control over labor. The legacies of emancipation in the French, Danish, Dutch, and Spanish Caribbean were mixed. Freedom did not erase deep inequalities in land ownership, political power, or social status. Formerly enslaved people often faced legal and economic barriers to independence, while planters sought to import indentured laborers from India, China, and elsewhere to work the plantations. These post-emancipation labor systems created new dynamics of migration, cultural exchange, and exploitation that would shape Caribbean societies for generations. By the late 19th century, legal slavery had been abolished throughout the Caribbean, but the struggle for true equality and economic autonomy continued. In the decades following the American Revolution, the United States developed a deep contradiction at the heart of its national identity. The new republic had been founded on ideals of liberty and equality, yet it preserved and expanded a system of human bondage that denied freedom to millions. While northern states gradually abolished slavery, the southern economy became ever more dependent on it, leading to an increasingly bitter sectional divide that would dominate American politics for the first half of the 19th century. At the time of independence in the 1780s, slavery existed in every state, though it was more concentrated in the South. In the North, a combination of moral opposition, changing economic patterns, and gradual emancipation laws led to the decline of slavery. By the early 19th century, most northern states had either abolished the institution or set a timetable for its end. This created a stark regional contrast, a free North and a slave-holding South, linked by a shared constitution but diverging in values and economic systems. In the South, the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 transformed the economics of slavery. This simple machine dramatically increased the efficiency of removing seeds from short-staple cotton, which could be grown in inland areas where long-staple cotton would not thrive. The result was an explosion in cotton cultivation across the Deep South, states such as Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Cotton became the nation's most valuable export, fueling both Southern prosperity and Northern textile industries. This cotton boom required vast amounts of labor, and because the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed by the United States in 1808, planters turned to the domestic slave trade to meet their needs. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were forcibly moved from the Upper South, where tobacco cultivation was declining, to the expanding cotton frontier. Families were torn apart as people were sold down the river to distant plantations, in one of the largest internal forced migrations in American history. Resistance to slavery took many forms during this period. Enslaved people resisted through everyday acts, slowing work, breaking tools, feigning illness, preserving cultural traditions, and maintaining family bonds despite the threat of separation. Some escaped, making use of networks of safe houses and sympathetic allies that became known collectively as the Underground Railroad. Figures such as Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave, risked their lives to guide others to freedom. There were also violent uprisings, though these were less common given the immense risks involved. In 1831, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher in Virginia, led one of the most famous revolts in American history. Turner and his followers killed more than 50 white people before the rebellion was suppressed. The aftermath was brutal. White militias and mobs killed hundreds of African Americans, many of whom had no involvement in the uprising. Southern states responded with harsher slave codes, restricting the movement, assembly, and education of both enslaved and free black people. In the North, the abolitionist movement gained strength in the early 19th century. William Lloyd Garrison launched The Liberator in 1831, a newspaper dedicated to the immediate abolition of slavery. Garrison's uncompromising stance and powerful rhetoric made him a controversial figure, even among fellow abolitionists who favored gradual emancipation. Black leaders such as Frederick Douglass, a former slave who escaped to freedom, brought unmatched authority and eloquence to the cause through speeches and writings. Douglass's autobiography, first published in 1845, became a powerful indictment of the institution. The legal framework of the United States repeatedly brought slavery into the political spotlight. The Missouri Compromise of 1821 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, maintaining the balance in the Senate while prohibiting slavery in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of a certain latitude. This temporary settlement did not resolve the underlying tensions, as new territories continued to be added to the nation. The annexation of Texas in 1845 and the war with Mexico, which concluded in 1848, brought vast new territories under American control. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in these lands reignited sectional conflict. The Compromise of 1850, a complex package of laws, admitted California as a free state, allowed new territories to decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty, and, most controversially, strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. This law required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves and imposed heavy penalties on those who aided escapees. Its enforcement enraged Northern public opinion and spurred greater participation in the abolitionist movement. The Fugitive Slave Act also gave rise to dramatic confrontations, such as the rescue of Shadrach Minkins in Boston in 1851 and the Christiana Resistance in Pennsylvania that same year, in which armed African Americans and white abolitionists resisted slave catchers. These incidents further polarized the nation, with Southerners accusing the North of failing to uphold constitutional obligations, and Northerners condemning the law as an affront to justice. The Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sandford in 1857 deepened the divide. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived in free territory. The court ruled against him, declaring that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be citizens of the United States, and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This decision effectively nullified earlier compromises and made the expansion of slavery a legal possibility across all federal territories. By the late 1850s, the United States was in a state of political crisis. The Republican Party, founded in 1854 on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, gained rapid support in the North. Southerners viewed the party's rise as a direct threat to their way of life. The debates between Republican Senate candidate Abraham Lincoln and Democratic incumbent Stephen Douglas in Illinois in 1858 crystallized the national argument. Could the United States endure permanently divided between free and slave states? In these decades, the polarization of the Republic was not only political, but cultural and moral. In the South, pro-slavery intellectuals developed elaborate justifications for the institution, portraying it as a positive good that provided stability and Christian civilization to those they enslaved. In the North, abolitionists increasingly framed the struggle as a test of the nation's commitment to its founding ideals. Both sides saw their position as essential to the survival of the Republic, leaving little room for compromise. By 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln without a single electoral vote from the South convinced many Southern leaders that their position within the Union was untenable. Secession and civil war were now on the horizon. When the guns fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the United States plunged into a civil war that would last 4 years and cost more than 600,000 lives. At the outset, the stated aim of the federal government under President Abraham Lincoln was to preserve the Union, not to abolish slavery. Yet the conflict between North and South inevitably placed the institution of slavery at the center of the struggle. Over the course of the war, the aims of the Union evolved, shaped by military necessity, political calculation, and the actions of enslaved people themselves. The Confederacy, formed by 11 Southern states that seceded from the Union, was explicitly committed to the preservation and expansion of slavery. Its leaders, including Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, openly declared that the cornerstone of their new nation was the belief in the racial inequality of black and white people and the right of whites to hold black people in bondage. The Confederate war effort relied heavily on enslaved labor to produce food, build fortifications, and perform other tasks that freed white men to serve in the army. In the early months of the war, the federal government faced a practical dilemma. Enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines in significant numbers, seeking protection. This created an immediate question for Union officers. Should these escapees be returned to their Confederate owners, as the Fugitive Slave Act still technically required, or should they be treated as contraband of war, enemy property that could be confiscated? In May of 1861, General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe in Virginia adopted the latter approach, declaring that escaped slaves who reached Union lines would not be returned. This contraband policy spread quickly, undermining the enforcement of fugitive slave laws in Union-occupied territory. The steady stream of self-emancipated men, women, and children into Union camps demonstrated that enslaved people were not passive bystanders to the war, but active participants shaping its outcome. Their presence also influenced the politics of the conflict, as abolitionists in the North pressed Lincoln to make emancipation an official war aim. At first, Lincoln moved cautiously, wary of alienating the border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, which remained in the Union but still allowed slavery. By 1862, however, several factors pushed Lincoln toward a more decisive stance. The scale of the war had grown, with mounting casualties and no quick victory in sight. Emancipation offered a way to weaken the Confederacy by depriving it of its labor force, while also adding to Union strength through the enlistment of black soldiers. Internationally, abolition could also help prevent Britain or France from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy, as public opinion in both countries was strongly anti-slavery. In September of 1862, following the Union's strategic victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This document warned that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in states or parts of states still in rebellion against the United States would be declared free. The proclamation did not apply to the border states or to Confederate areas already under Union control, reflecting both legal limitations and political compromises. When the final Emancipation Proclamation took effect, it transformed the character of the war. Though it did not immediately free every enslaved person, it made the destruction of slavery an explicit Union war aim and authorized the enlistment of black men in the armed forces. Nearly 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors would serve in the Union cause, many of them formerly enslaved. The United States colored troops fought in major battles from Port Hudson to Petersburg, earning a reputation for courage and determination despite facing discrimination, lower pay, and the threat of execution if captured by Confederate forces. The Confederacy responded to the proclamation with outrage, and in practice, it refused to treat captured black Union soldiers as prisoners of war. Instead, many were murdered or re-enslaved. One of the most infamous incidents occurred at Fort Pillow in Tennessee in April of 1864, where Confederate troops under General Nathan Bedford Forrest massacred African American soldiers after they had surrendered. Such atrocities further hardened Northern resolve to see the war through to total victory. Within the Union, emancipation policies advanced alongside military progress. Union armies moving deeper into Confederate territory enforced the liberation of enslaved people, sometimes through the establishment of contraband camps where the freed could find refuge. Conditions in these camps were often difficult, with overcrowding, disease, and shortages of supplies. But they were also centers of transition, where education and wage labor began to take root. Missionary societies and the Freedmen's Aid societies sent teachers and supplies, laying the groundwork for post-war Reconstruction. By 1864, Lincoln was firmly committed to ending slavery as a condition for peace. In his public statements, he linked the cause of union to the cause of freedom, declaring in his Gettysburg Address of 1863 that the war was a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure. His re-election in 1864, aided by battlefield victories such as Sherman's capture of Atlanta, ensured that emancipation would not be reversed by a change in administration. The legal completion of emancipation came with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Passed by Congress in January of 1865 and ratified by the states in December of that year, it abolished slavery and involuntary servitude throughout the United States, except as punishment for a crime. This amendment gave permanent legal force to the freedom that the Emancipation Proclamation had proclaimed for those in rebel territory. The war ended in April of 1865 with the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. But emancipation was not a simple, singular moment. Freedom was claimed in stages as Union forces reached different parts of the South. In Texas, for example, news of emancipation arrived only in June of 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger issued General Order No. 3 in Galveston. This date is now commemorated as Juneteenth, marking the delayed arrival of freedom for the last enslaved people in the former Confederacy. The Civil War thus became not just a battle to preserve the United States, but the largest act of emancipation in American history, achieved through the convergence of military action, political will, and the self-liberation efforts of enslaved people. Yet the end of slavery in law did not end the struggle for equality. As the next period of Reconstruction would reveal, the meaning of freedom was contested from the very beginning, and the promises of emancipation would face fierce resistance. The surrender of the Confederacy in the spring of 1865 ended the Civil War, but opened a new and uncertain chapter in American history. The destruction of slavery created a vast and urgent question. What would freedom mean for the 4 million African Americans who had been emancipated? For a brief moment, known as Reconstruction, the United States attempted to remake itself as a nation without slavery, grounded in equal citizenship. But the promise of this era was contested from the very beginning, and by the turn of the 20th century, much of it had been dismantled, replaced by new systems of racial subjugation. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the South lay in ruins. Plantations, towns, and infrastructure had been devastated. The Confederate currency was worthless, and the economy, long dependent on enslaved labor, was in crisis. Formerly enslaved people, newly freed by the 13th Amendment, sought to reunite families torn apart by sale, establish independent households, and secure the fruits of their labor. Many traveled long distances in search of relatives, placing advertisements in newspapers or relying on word-of-mouth networks to find lost kin. The federal government, recognizing the scale of the challenge, created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in 1865, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. This agency was tasked with providing assistance to freed people and poor whites, including distributing food, negotiating labor contracts, establishing schools, and offering legal support. Under the Bureau's guidance, thousands of schools for African Americans were opened across the South, staffed by teachers from both the North and the local black community. Literacy rates, which had been suppressed under slavery, began to rise rapidly. At the same time, Southern white elites sought to restore their control over the labor force through the passage of Black Codes, laws that restricted the movement, employment, and civil rights of African Americans. These codes varied by state but often included vagrancy laws allowing authorities to arrest black people without proof of employment, apprenticeship laws binding black children to white employers, and contract laws designed to lock workers into annual labor agreements under exploitative terms. In response, the federal government entered what historians call radical Reconstruction. Congressional Republicans, many of them committed to ensuring civil rights for freed people, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which established birthright citizenship and guaranteed equal protection under the law. This was followed by the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, enshrining these principles in the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment in 1870, prohibiting states from denying the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Under military supervision, Southern states were required to rewrite their constitutions, extend suffrage to black men, and ratify the new amendments before being readmitted to the Union. For the first time, African American men held elected office at every level of government, from local councils to the United States Congress. Figures such as Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce served as senators from Mississippi, while hundreds of others held positions in state legislatures, shaping laws on education, labor, and civil rights. The political gains of Reconstruction, however, faced violent resistance. White supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan emerged in the late 1860s, using terror to intimidate black voters, attack Republican leaders, and undermine Reconstruction governments. The federal government responded with enforcement acts and military intervention, which temporarily reduced Klan activity, but did not eradicate organized racial violence. Economically, freedom proved fragile. While many freed people aspired to own land, the federal promise of 40 acres and a mule was never fulfilled on a broad scale. In some areas, confiscated Confederate land was returned to its former owners. Without land or capital, most African Americans entered into sharecropping or tenant farming arrangements. These systems allowed families to farm plots in exchange for a share of the crop, but they were often trapped in cycles of debt due to high interest rates, unfair accounting by landlords, and the necessity of buying supplies on credit. This economic dependency created conditions that, while legally distinct from slavery, still tied black labor to white-controlled land under oppressive terms. Another form of unfreedom emerged in the convict leasing system. Southern states began leasing prisoners, disproportionately African American men, to private businesses, including railroads, mines, and plantations. Conditions for leased convicts were often worse than under slavery, as employers had no long-term investment in their lives or health. Arrest rates for minor offenses rose sharply, suggesting that the criminal justice system was being used to supply this new form of forced labor. By the mid-1870s, Northern political will to enforce Reconstruction began to wane. Economic depression, political scandals, and the desire to reconcile with Southern whites led to reduced federal oversight. The contested presidential election of 1876 resulted in a political compromise that effectively ended Reconstruction. In exchange for conceding the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. The withdrawal marked the beginning of what came to be known as the Jim Crow era. Southern states implemented segregation laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures to disenfranchise African Americans. Violence and intimidation further suppressed black political participation. By the 1890s, court decisions such as Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the doctrine of separate but equal, giving legal sanction to racial segregation. For African Americans, the post-Reconstruction decades were a period of both endurance and institution building. Despite disenfranchisement and discrimination, black communities established churches, schools, and mutual aid societies that provided support and a foundation for future activism. Leaders such as Ida B. Wells campaigned against lynching, while Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois articulated differing strategies for advancing black rights, one emphasizing vocational education and economic self-help, the other calling for immediate political and civil equality. The end of the 19th century left a bitter legacy. The promise of Reconstruction, that the United States could rebuild as a multiracial democracy with full citizenship for all, had been undermined by violence, political compromise, and the creation of new systems of racial control. Yet the struggles and institutions built during this period ensured that the fight for equality would continue into the 20th century. In the 19th century, while the United States and many European colonial powers were moving toward the abolition of slavery, much of Latin America continued to rely on enslaved labor. The largest and most enduring of these systems existed in Brazil, which by the mid-19th century had become the single greatest importer of enslaved Africans in history and the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. The path to emancipation in Brazil and in neighboring territories such as Cuba was long, contested, and shaped by a mix of international pressure, internal activism, and economic transformation. By 1850, Brazil's slave system was deeply entrenched. The country's vast agricultural estates produced coffee, sugar, and cotton for export, all dependent on enslaved labor. Brazil had already received an estimated 4 million Africans over the course of the transatlantic trade, far more than any other destination. Even after the formal abolition of the international slave trade to Brazil in 1850, illegal trafficking continued for years, sustained by the high demand for labor and the complicity of local elites. The trade's suppression was driven in large part by Britain's aggressive naval campaign. The British government, having abolished its own trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, sought to eliminate the traffic globally. Treaties with Brazil in the early 19th century had prohibited the trade, but enforcement was lax. British frustration led to the so-called Aberdeen Act of 1845, which authorized the Royal Navy to seize Brazilian slave ships. The increased pressure, combined with domestic political debates, led Brazil to pass the Eusébio de Queiroz Law in 1850, officially banning the importation of enslaved Africans. This did not mean the end of slavery in Brazil. With no new captives arriving from Africa, the internal slave market became the primary source of labor. Enslaved people were sold from the northeastern sugar provinces to the rapidly expanding coffee plantations in the southeast, particularly in São Paulo. This internal trade fractured families and communities, much as the domestic slave trade had done in the United States. Abolitionist sentiment within Brazil grew slowly but steadily in the decades that followed. Intellectuals, journalists, and members of the emerging urban middle class began to criticize slavery as incompatible with modernity and national progress. Among them was Joaquim Nabuco, one of the most prominent Brazilian abolitionists, who argued that slavery corrupted both master and slave and impeded the country's development. His writings and speeches helped to frame abolition as a moral, political, and economic necessity. In the 1870s, Brazil began to adopt gradualist measures that chipped away at the institution without immediately dismantling it. The law of the free womb, passed in 1871, declared that all children born to enslaved mothers after that date would be considered free, though they were required to remain under the authority of the mother's owner until adulthood. This measure was intended as a compromise between abolitionists and slaveholders, but it was slow to effect real change. The vast majority of enslaved people in the country remained in bondage. A second major reform came with the Sexagenarian Law of 1885, which freed enslaved people over the age of 60. Again, the law affected only a small portion of the enslaved population, and many of those freed were past their prime working years, limiting their economic independence. Critics saw it as a way for slaveholders to rid themselves of older dependents while holding on to their productive workforce. While the government pursued these gradual measures, resistance from below intensified. Enslaved people engaged in flight, sabotage, and the formation of quilombos, communities of runaway slaves in remote areas. Urban abolitionist societies organized fundraising to purchase individual freedoms and held public events to rally support. Newspapers sympathetic to the cause spread abolitionist ideas throughout the country, creating a climate in which slavery was increasingly viewed as an embarrassment in the eyes of the world. The final push toward emancipation came in the late 1880s, when mass desertions from plantations and the defiance of military units stationed in areas with large slave populations undermined the system's viability. By this point, slavery had become politically untenable. Internationally, Brazil was one of the very last holdouts in a world where slavery was increasingly condemned. Domestically, it faced growing unrest and a loss of control over the enslaved population. On May 13, 1888, the Regent Princess Isabel signed the Lei Áurea, or Golden Law, which abolished slavery in Brazil without conditions or compensation to slaveholders. The law's passage was met with celebrations in abolitionist circles and in the streets, particularly among the newly freed. Yet its brevity, it consisted of only 2 sentences, meant that it offered no provisions for the economic or social integration of former slaves. Many were left to navigate freedom without land, education, or resources, facing discrimination and limited opportunities. Brazil's journey to abolition had parallels with other parts of Latin America, though each followed its own trajectory. In Cuba, under Spanish rule, slavery persisted well into the late 19th century. The island's sugar industry was booming, and planters resisted abolition fiercely. The 10 Years' War for Independence, which began in 1868, brought the question of slavery into sharp focus, as rebel forces often promised freedom to those who joined their cause. The Spanish government responded with gradual reforms, including the Moret Law of 1870, which freed children born to enslaved mothers and slaves over 60. Complete abolition did not come until 1886, 2 years before Brazil, and like in Brazil, it was enacted without compensation to the formerly enslaved. In other Latin American nations, abolition came earlier, often in the context of independence movements. Chile abolished slavery in 1823, Mexico in 1829, and much of Central America in the early 1820s. These measures were sometimes more symbolic than practical, given the smaller scale of slavery in those regions, but they reflected the influence of republican ideals and the rejection of colonial systems. The abolition of slavery in Brazil and its neighbors was thus the product of both internal and external forces. Pressure from Britain and other powers, the activism of abolitionists, the resistance of the enslaved, and shifts in the economic logic of plantation agriculture. Yet, as in other parts of the Americas, legal freedom did not bring immediate equality. Formerly enslaved people often entered into tenant farming, sharecropping, or low-paid wage labor, and racial prejudice continued to shape access to land, education, and political power. By the close of the 19th century, slavery in the Americas had ended in law, but its legacies persisted in entrenched inequalities and social hierarchies. The next stage of the global abolition story would move beyond the Atlantic to other parts of the world where slavery still existed, sometimes openly, sometimes under the guise of other forms of servitude. While the 19th century saw slavery abolished in law across much of the Atlantic world, in Africa and the Indian Ocean regions, the picture was more complex. Slavery in these areas was deeply rooted in local economies, political systems, and cultural practices, and it took multiple forms, ranging from domestic servitude to large-scale agricultural labor, military service, and trade in markets that connected Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. The century witnessed increasing European involvement as imperial expansion, missionary activity, and diplomatic agreements began to reshape the systems of bondage. Yet these changes were rarely straightforward. In many cases, the suppression of the slave trade was intertwined with the expansion of colonial rule, creating a new set of dynamics rather than a simple transition to freedom. At the dawn of the century, several major slave trading networks operated across Africa. In the West, the transatlantic trade still carried millions across the ocean until Britain and other powers began enforcement campaigns in the early decades. In the East, the Indian Ocean slave trade linked the Swahili coast of East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and beyond. From ports like Kilwa, Zanzibar, and Mombasa, merchants shipped enslaved Africans to markets in Oman, Yemen, the Gulf, and as far as India and Southeast Asia. This eastern trade was dominated by Arab and Swahili merchant elites, with Zanzibar emerging as the central hub. By the early 19th century, the Sultan of Oman, Said, had moved his court to Zanzibar, making it the capital of a vast commercial network. Clove plantations on Zanzibar and Pemba Islands relied heavily on enslaved African labor, while the interior regions of present-day Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Congo Basin were raided or drawn into trading systems to supply captives. The journeys to the coast were often deadly, with captives forced to march hundreds of miles in chains. Britain, having committed itself to the suppression of the slave trade in the early 19th century, turned its attention to the Indian Ocean as part of a broader campaign. British naval patrols began operating in the Arabian Sea and the Western Indian Ocean, intercepting slave dhows much as they did slave ships in the Atlantic. However, enforcement was difficult. The vessels were small, fast, and often blended in with legitimate trade. Moreover, Britain's ability to act depended on securing treaties with local rulers. One of the most significant of these agreements was the Moresby Treaty of 1822 between Britain and the Sultan of Oman. It limited the sale of slaves to Christian nations but left the trade to Muslim territories untouched. Later treaties, such as the Hamerton Treaty of 1845, went further, prohibiting the export of slaves from East Africa to certain foreign markets. Yet again, these measures did not end the internal trade or the demand for enslaved labor within the region. European explorers and missionaries played a complex role in this context. Figures like David Livingstone in the mid-19th century documented the horrors of the East African trade, publishing accounts that shocked European audiences. Livingstone's descriptions of chained caravans and devastated villages helped to mobilize public opinion in Britain and other countries, linking anti-slavery sentiment to the growing push for colonial intervention in Africa. Missionaries established stations where they sought to redeem and educate liberated Africans, but these missions also often worked hand-in-hand with imperial authorities. In North and West Africa, the suppression of the transatlantic trade had mixed results. The decline of overseas trafficking sometimes led to the expansion of internal slavery, as captives who might have been sold abroad were instead absorbed into domestic labor systems. In states such as Sokoto in present-day Nigeria, slavery was integral to the economy, providing agricultural labor, household service, and soldiers for the caliphate's armies. The abolition of the Atlantic trade did not directly challenge these systems, and in some cases, European powers tolerated or even relied upon local forms of servitude to maintain political alliances before outright colonization. The latter half of the century brought profound changes as European powers intensified their scramble for Africa. Anti-slavery rhetoric became a prominent justification for colonial conquest. Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal argued that extending their control over African territories was necessary to suppress slavery and the slave trade. While colonial regimes did pass laws against slave trading, they often allowed forms of coerced labor, such as compulsory public works, forced agricultural schemes, and hut taxes designed to push Africans into wage labor that closely resembled slavery in practice. In East Africa, Britain's influence over Zanzibar grew steadily after the 1870s. The 1873 treaty between Britain and Sultan Bargash prohibited the public sale of slaves in Zanzibar and closed the island's slave market. This was hailed in Britain as a major humanitarian triumph, but in reality, slavery persisted in private households and on plantations for decades. Freed individuals often had limited options beyond entering into client relationships with former masters or working for low wages on the same estates. In Madagascar, the French and British both pushed for the suppression of the slave trade in the mid-century, but domestic slavery remained widespread. When France established colonial control over the island in the 1890s, it formally abolished slavery. But as elsewhere, coerced labor under colonial authority replaced many of the old systems. The Indian Ocean world beyond Africa also saw gradual legal restrictions. In the Persian Gulf, treaties between Britain and local rulers in the 1870s and 1880s aimed to end the import of African slaves, though clandestine traffic continued well into the 20th century. In the French Indian Ocean colonies of Réunion and Mayotte, emancipation came in line with French colonial abolition in 1848. But indentured labor from India quickly became the dominant form of plantation work. By the turn of the century, the legal architecture for abolishing slavery across Africa and the Indian Ocean had largely been put in place through treaties, colonial decrees, and international agreements. However, the social and economic realities were far slower to change. Former slaves often remained dependent on former masters or tied to land they did not own. Many colonial administrations adopted policies that blurred the lines between abolition and new forms of forced labor, undermining the very principles they claimed to uphold. The 19th century transformation of slavery in Africa and the Indian Ocean thus cannot be seen simply as a humanitarian success story. It was a process deeply entangled with imperial ambitions, shifting global markets, and the strategies of local rulers navigating foreign pressure. While the public markets for buying and selling human beings were closed and the legal right to own a person was increasingly challenged, the underlying hierarchies and economic systems that had supported slavery often adapted rather than disappeared. By the final decade of the 19th century, legal abolition of slavery had been declared across much of the world, yet the institution persisted in many regions in practice. Enslaved people were still being traded along clandestine routes, coerced labor systems thrived under colonial administrations, and new forms of servitude blurred the line between freedom and bondage. At the same time, a new stage in the fight against slavery was emerging, one that moved beyond the efforts of individual nations and into the realm of international law. For the first time, governments sought to make the abolition of slavery a shared global standard, backed by multilateral agreements, collective enforcement measures, and a broadened understanding of what slavery meant. The first major international step in this direction was the Brussels Conference Act of 1890. Convened by the major European powers, along with the Ottoman Empire and other states, the conference was initially aimed at coordinating efforts to suppress the African slave trade. It was held in the context of the scramble for Africa, when European colonial empires were rapidly expanding their territorial control across the continent. Humanitarian concerns about the slave trade merged with imperial ambitions, as colonial powers argued that controlling African territory was essential to stopping the traffic. The Brussels Act committed its signatories to cooperate in the suppression of the slave trade by land and sea, particularly in the interior of Africa. It called for the establishment of administrative structures in colonial territories to prevent the capture and transport of slaves, as well as measures to promote legitimate commerce as an alternative to the slave trade. It also addressed the sale of firearms and alcohol to Africans, reflecting a paternalistic belief that controlling trade goods could help dismantle systems of bondage. While the Brussels Act represented an important symbolic commitment, its enforcement was uneven. Colonial powers interpreted their obligations differently, and in many cases they focused on suppressing long-distance slave trading while tolerating or even perpetuating local systems of forced labor. Nevertheless, it marked a turning point by placing the abolition of slavery into an international legal framework, rather than leaving it solely to national legislation. In the early 20th century, the rise of international organizations provided new forums for addressing slavery. The League of Nations, established after the First World War, inherited responsibility for overseeing mandates, former colonies and territories of defeated powers, where slavery still existed. Reports from these territories revealed that while the legal status of slavery was often abolished, coercive labor systems remained common, especially in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The most significant step taken by the League was the Slavery Convention of 1926. Drafted after several years of investigation, it defined slavery as the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. This definition was deliberately broad, allowing for the inclusion of situations where people might not be formally recognized as property, but were nonetheless controlled in a way that amounted to ownership. The 1926 convention committed its signatories to prevent and suppress the slave trade, and to bring about progressively and as soon as possible the complete abolition of slavery in all its forms. It also addressed practices similar to slavery, such as debt bondage and serfdom, though without giving them the same precise legal definition. While enforcement mechanisms were limited, the convention's language was influential in setting an international standard. The League of Nations also monitored reports on slavery and forced labor from member states. In some cases, public exposure of abuses prompted reforms, as in Liberia in the 1930s, when an investigation revealed that government officials were complicit in the forced labor and export of workers to Spanish plantations on the island of Fernando Po. International pressure eventually led to Liberia's acceptance of reform measures. The outbreak of the Second World War interrupted much of the League's work, but the creation of the United Nations in 1945 revived international engagement with human rights issues, including slavery. The horrors of the war, particularly the use of forced labor by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, broadened awareness of how systems of coercion could operate on a massive scale, even in the modern industrial era. In the post-war period, the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 enshrined the principle that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. This was the first global statement of its kind, declaring abolition a universal human right. However, the declaration was not legally binding, which led to further efforts to create enforceable treaties. The most comprehensive of these was the United Nations Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and Institutions and Practices Similar to Slavery, adopted in 1956. This treaty sought to close loopholes left by earlier conventions by explicitly targeting a wider range of practices that were not strictly chattel slavery, but still placed people in conditions of severe dependency and exploitation. The 1956 convention listed as prohibited practices: debt bondage, where labor is pledged against a loan that cannot realistically be repaid; serfdom, where people are bound to live and work on land belonging to another; servile forms of marriage, including child marriage and practices where women can be inherited as property; and the exploitation of children and adolescents for labor. Signatories were required to enact national laws to criminalize these practices and to cooperate internationally in their suppression. By the mid-20th century, the principle of abolition had been firmly embedded in international law. Slavery was no longer considered an acceptable domestic matter within a sovereign state, but a violation of a universally recognized human right. The challenge, however, remained in translating these legal norms into reality. Many countries that ratified the conventions continued to tolerate bonded labor, child servitude, or other exploitative systems, often under the guise of tradition or economic necessity. Nevertheless, the shift from national abolition acts to binding international agreements marked a profound change in the history of the movement against slavery. It created a shared legal vocabulary, set common standards, and laid the groundwork for later human rights campaigns that would focus on trafficking, forced labor, and modern forms of exploitation. By the middle of the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of the world's nations had formally abolished slavery in law. International agreements, especially those negotiated under the League of Nations and later the United Nations, had declared the institution a violation of fundamental human rights. Yet, in reality, the legal eradication of slavery was not complete. In several countries, slavery remained explicitly permitted in domestic law, or persisted as a tolerated custom despite formal bans elsewhere. The period from the 1940s to the early 21st century witnessed the final legal abolitions in these holdout states, followed, often decades later, by the criminalization of slavery as a punishable offense. One of the earliest of these late abolitions occurred in Ethiopia. Slavery had been part of Ethiopian society for centuries, supplying domestic servants, agricultural workers, and soldiers. While Emperor Haile Selassie had announced a partial ban before the Italian invasion in the 1930s, the institution persisted, especially in rural areas. After Ethiopia's liberation from Italian occupation in 1941, the emperor issued a proclamation in 1942, formally outlawing slavery and freeing all remaining enslaved people. Enforcement was gradual, and vestiges of servile relationships continued in some regions for years afterward. In the Arabian Peninsula, slavery was deeply embedded in social and economic life, including the ownership of domestic servants, pearl divers, and agricultural workers. Saudi Arabia and Yemen were among the most prominent holdouts. Under international pressure and facing modernization plans, Saudi Arabia formally abolished slavery in 1962. Followed by Yemen in the same year after a Republican revolution overthrew the Imamate. These abolitions freed tens of thousands, though many remained tied to former masters through dependency or debt. The United Arab Emirates, which at the time consisted of the trucial states under British protection, officially ended slavery in 1963 as part of preparations for eventual unification and independence. In Oman, slavery persisted longer. The Sultanate's economy relied on enslaved labor for domestic work, agriculture, and date cultivation, particularly along the Batina coast and in Zanzibar, which Oman had ruled in earlier centuries. Sultan Qaboos, who came to power in 1970 after deposing his father, issued a decree formally abolishing slavery that same year, in line with broader modernization reforms and under international scrutiny. Perhaps the most striking case of late abolition is that of Mauritania, a West African nation where slavery had been deeply entrenched in its social hierarchy. Enslaved people, often from specific ethnic groups, served as domestic workers and herders, bound by hereditary status. Mauritania formally abolished slavery in 1980, the last country in the world to do so. However, the law carried no criminal penalties for slaveholding, and in practice, slavery continued in many areas. In the decades that followed, activists within Mauritania and international human rights organizations pressed for stronger measures. A law passed in 2007 made slavery a criminal offense punishable by prison sentences. This was further reinforced by legislation in 2015, which declared slavery a crime against humanity and strengthened enforcement mechanisms. Yet, despite these laws, reports from the early 21st century continue to document cases of hereditary servitude, highlighting the gulf between legal abolition and social reality. Other nations also took steps during this period to align their domestic laws with international commitments. In countries such as Niger, Mali, and Sudan, where slavery had been officially banned in the colonial or early post-colonial era, the 21st century saw court cases and legislation aimed at prosecuting modern instances of slavery. In Niger, for example, a landmark case in 2008 convicted a man for keeping a woman in slavery, marking one of the first such legal victories in West Africa. The persistence of slavery in these contexts was tied to multiple factors: the remoteness of affected communities, the reluctance of governments to confront influential local elites, the lack of awareness among those enslaved that they had legal rights, and the blending of slavery with systems of caste, kinship, and economic dependency. Even where abolition was complete in law, the dismantling of entrenched social structures proved far more difficult. The international community's role in these late abolitions was significant. Organizations such as the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, ILO, and non-governmental advocacy groups exerted diplomatic and public pressure on holdout states. In some cases, aid and trade relationships were leveraged to encourage reform. Yet, the emphasis often remained on legal declarations rather than comprehensive programs to provide former slaves with land, education, or livelihoods. In the Gulf states, for instance, the abolition of slavery coincided with the discovery and exploitation of oil, which transformed their economies. While the formal ownership of people ended, new patterns of labor exploitation emerged, particularly in the treatment of migrant workers under restrictive sponsorship systems. Though not legally slavery, these arrangements could involve severe restrictions on movement, confiscation of passports, and abusive working conditions, raising debates about the boundaries between unfree labor and slavery-like practices. The trajectory from the mid-20th century to the early 21st thus illustrates a paradox in the history of abolition. By the year 2000, slavery was universally prohibited under international law, and nearly every nation on earth had incorporated this prohibition into its domestic statutes. Yet the lived reality for many remained unchanged, as the legacies of slavery persisted in social structures, economic inequalities, and exploitative labor systems. The final legal abolitions and criminalizations closed the formal chapter on slavery as a legally recognized institution. They also underscored that legal change, while essential, is only the first step in dismantling systems of oppression. In many of these countries, the real work of abolition, ensuring that freedom is substantive, not merely formal, remains ongoing. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, planters in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and other colonial territories faced an immediate and pressing question: how to replace the vast labor force that had sustained plantation economies for centuries. Many formerly enslaved Africans left the estates to farm their own land, work for wages on their own terms, or join other occupations. The result was a severe labor shortage from the perspective of the colonial elite, who feared the collapse of lucrative export industries such as sugar. To solve this labor problem, colonial authorities and planters turned to a system that was not slavery in name, but often mirrored its coercive realities: indentured labor. The basic idea was to recruit workers under contract for a fixed term, typically between 3 and 5 years, during which they would be bound to a specific employer. In exchange, they were promised wages, housing, and, in some cases, return passage to their homeland. In practice, the conditions were often harsh, the contracts exploitative, and the workers' freedom to leave or change employment severely restricted. The largest source of indentured labor was India. Beginning in 1834, just as apprenticeship for emancipated Africans was coming to an end in the British Caribbean, recruiters in India began signing up men and women, often from impoverished rural communities, to work overseas. Many were from the Bhojpuri-speaking regions of present-day Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, as well as from southern India. Recruiters, known as arkatas, were paid per recruit and often used deceptive promises about wages, living conditions, and the nature of the work. From India, ships carried indentured laborers to colonies across the world: British Guiana, later Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, Mauritius, Fiji, and South Africa among them. The voyages were long and difficult, with cramped quarters and inadequate provisions. Disease outbreaks were common, and mortality rates, while lower than on the middle passage of the earlier Atlantic slave trade, were still significant in the early years. Indentured workers often found that plantation life under this new system differed little from the slavery it was meant to replace. Workdays were long. Punishments for breaches of contract could include fines or imprisonment, and living conditions were basic at best. Although contracts promised wages, deductions for food, clothing, and other expenses could leave workers with little money at the end of their term. A similar system operated with Chinese indentured laborers, often referred to as coolies in the language of the time, a term now recognized as pejorative. Beginning in the 1840s, Chinese workers were recruited, sometimes forcibly, from southern provinces such as Guangdong and Fujian. Many went to Cuba, Peru, and the British and Dutch Caribbean. In Cuba and Peru, conditions for Chinese laborers were notoriously brutal, with high mortality rates and treatment akin to slavery. Reports of abuse sparked diplomatic tensions, especially between Britain and Spain, as Britain sought to protect its subjects from what it saw as inhumane conditions. The recruitment of indentured labor also extended to smaller Asian regions and other parts of the world. Workers came from the Malay Archipelago, Japan, and the Pacific Islands, particularly to labor on plantations in Queensland, Samoa, and Hawaii. In the Indian Ocean, Mauritius became one of the largest recipients of Indian indentured workers, whose labor sustained the island's sugar industry well into the late 19th century. Colonial authorities justified indenture as a voluntary system, citing signed contracts and the promise of return passage. Yet the power imbalance between employers and workers, combined with the remoteness of the colonies, made enforcement of workers' rights minimal. Many laborers were illiterate or unfamiliar with the legal terms of the agreements they signed, and once abroad, they were subject to the laws and policing of colonial administrations that prioritized planter interests. Resistance to the system took many forms. Some workers deserted plantations, escaping into towns or rural areas where they could blend into free communities. Others protested through strikes, petitions, and occasionally uprisings. In British Guiana, for example, a series of strikes in the late 19th century highlighted grievances over wages, working conditions, and the length of contracts. The most famous protest in Fiji occurred in the early 20th century, when Indian workers organized against poor treatment, attracting international attention. Criticism of the indenture system grew steadily, both in the colonies and in the metropole. Missionaries, journalists, and Indian nationalists condemned it as a new system of slavery, a phrase popularized by leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi. In the early 1900s, Gandhi, then living in South Africa, campaigned vigorously against the mistreatment of Indian indentured laborers, linking their struggle to the broader fight for Indian rights within the British Empire. In response to mounting criticism, reforms were introduced. Recruitment practices were more closely regulated, contracts were standardized, and inspections of ships and plantations became more common. Still, abuses persisted, and by the early 20th century, political pressure to end the system was growing. The First World War played a significant role in the demise of indentured labor. Wartime disruptions to shipping, combined with India's increased political leverage as Britain's crucial ally, gave Indian leaders greater influence in imperial policy. In 1917, after years of agitation, the government of India announced the end of indentured recruitment. Existing contracts were allowed to expire, and no new workers were sent abroad. The legacy of the indenture system is visible in the demographic and cultural landscapes of many former plantation colonies. Large Indo-Caribbean communities in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname trace their origins to this period, as do Indo-Fijian and Indo-Mauritian populations. These communities have preserved elements of Indian language, religion, and culture, even as they developed new hybrid identities in their adopted lands. Similarly, Chinese diaspora communities in Cuba, Peru, and the Caribbean maintain links to this history. Indenture created lasting patterns of global migration, connecting rural villages in India and China to sugar estates in the Caribbean, gold mines in South Africa, and cane fields in the Pacific. It also left a complex legacy. While many descendants of indentured workers became integral to their new societies, the conditions under which their ancestors migrated were shaped by coercion, economic desperation, and the enduring shadow of slavery. The abolition of slavery in law did not erase its legacies. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, nations, communities, and individuals have continued to grapple with the economic, social, and cultural consequences of centuries of human bondage. This has taken many forms: the preservation and reinterpretation of historical memory, campaigns for reparative justice, and the identification and combat of new forms of slavery that persist despite international prohibitions. In the decades following emancipation across the world, the history of slavery was often silenced or distorted in official narratives. Colonial powers downplayed the brutality of the system, portraying abolition as a moral gift from above rather than the result of sustained resistance by the enslaved themselves. In the United States, the Post-Reconstruction era gave rise to myths of a benevolent slavery and narratives that romanticized the antebellum South, reinforcing racial hierarchies. In parts of the Caribbean, Africa, and Latin America, the memory of slavery was complicated by overlapping histories of colonialism, migration, and ethnic diversity, which sometimes blurred the direct lines of historical accountability. From the mid-20th century onward, however, the global movement for civil rights, decolonization, and human rights began to challenge these silences. In the United States, the civil rights movement not only fought against segregation and disenfranchisement, but also insisted on the importance of remembering slavery as foundational to the nation's history. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. drew connections between past and present struggles, framing the fight for equality as unfinished business from the abolition era. In the Caribbean, the post-independence generation began to demand a fuller acknowledgement of slavery's role in shaping their societies. Writers, historians, and artists placed the experiences of the enslaved at the center of national narratives. Figures such as Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, argued in works like Capitalism and Slavery that the wealth of Europe had been built on the exploitation of African labor, and that this economic debt remained unpaid. Museums, memorials, and commemorative practices have played a growing role in preserving the memory of slavery. Sites like the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and the Memorial Asti in Guadeloupe seek to document the global scope of the slave trade and the resistance to it. On Gorée Island in Senegal and Ouidah in Benin, the preserved slave forts and doors of no return stand as reminders of the millions taken from Africa. These spaces challenge visitors to confront the human cost of the trade and its enduring consequences. Alongside this work of remembrance has been a growing movement for reparations, compensation for the descendants of enslaved people, and for communities affected by slavery's legacy. The idea of reparations is not new. In the aftermath of emancipation, formerly enslaved people in the United States petitioned for land and resources to begin independent lives. These demands were largely ignored or reversed, as in the case of the 40 acres and a mule policy, briefly enacted and then rescinded during Reconstruction. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, reparations have returned to the political agenda in various forms. In the Caribbean community, CARICOM, established a reparations commission in 2013 to seek formal apologies and reparatory justice from former colonial powers, including Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Portugal. Their 10-point plan calls for measures such as debt cancellation, educational programs, technology transfer, and investments in public health as means to address the structural inequalities rooted in slavery and colonialism. In the United States, advocacy for reparations has gained momentum through the work of scholars, activists, and legislators. Congressional proposals, such as H.R. 40, seek to establish a commission to study the impacts of slavery and recommend appropriate remedies. Cities like Evanston, Illinois, have implemented local reparations programs, focusing on housing assistance for African American residents as a step toward addressing historical discrimination. Meanwhile, the conversation about slavery's legacies has broadened to include corporate and institutional accountability. Universities in the United States and Britain have undertaken investigations into their historical ties to slavery, revealing how endowments, buildings, and scholarships were funded by profits from the slave trade. Some, like Georgetown University, have offered preferential admission to descendants of enslaved people once owned by the institution, while others have pledged financial contributions to affected communities. Yet, even as the world reckons with the past, slavery has not vanished. The term modern slavery has been adopted by international organizations to describe a range of practices that involve severe exploitation, coercion, and the denial of basic freedoms. According to the International Labor Organization and other agencies, tens of millions of people worldwide are trapped in such conditions today. Modern slavery takes many forms: human trafficking for labor or sexual exploitation, debt bondage in agriculture and construction, forced domestic work, and the recruitment of child soldiers in conflict zones. Victims may be held through violence, threats, confiscation of identity documents, or manipulation of legal and economic vulnerabilities. While these practices do not operate under the legal ownership of persons as in historical chattel slavery, the effect on victims is one of profound loss of freedom and agency. Supply chains for global industries have also come under scrutiny. Investigations have revealed forced labor in the production of goods such as seafood, cocoa, electronics, and textiles. Governments and corporations are increasingly under pressure to implement due diligence laws that require transparency and the elimination of exploitative practices. For example, several countries have enacted modern slavery acts, obliging companies to report on their efforts to prevent forced labor in their supply chains. Grassroots activism remains a critical force in combating modern slavery. Survivor-led organizations, local NGOs, and community networks work to identify victims, provide legal and social support, and advocate for stronger enforcement of labor and anti-trafficking laws. International cooperation, while still imperfect, has grown through agreements like the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, adopted in 2000. The persistence of slavery in new forms underscores the reality that abolition is not a single historical event, but an ongoing process. Legal freedom, while essential, must be accompanied by economic, social, and political measures that protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. This requires not only state action, but also public awareness, consumer responsibility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the origins of wealth and the costs of cheap labor. In the 21st century, the global movement against slavery, past and present, has become part of a broader struggle for human rights, racial justice, and equality. The legacies of slavery are visible in disparities in wealth, education, and health, in patterns of migration, and in the persistence of racial prejudice. Efforts to address these legacies through reparations, memorialization, and the eradication of modern slavery are deeply interconnected, reminding us that history's injustices continue to shape today's world. The story of the abolition of slavery is therefore not only about the victories achieved in the 18th and 19th centuries, but also about the ongoing fight to ensure that freedom is meaningful and universal. The journey from enslavement to liberty is one that spans continents, centuries, and countless acts of resistance, each a testament to the enduring human demand for dignity and self-determination.